Hello folks, and welcome to our first Educational Technology Q&A session. I'm going to be reviewing questions that you posed in your initial and final thoughts posts for our first module, and hopefully my answers will get at topics and ideas you're most interested in. To kick things off, let's start with the question, how do I best integrate technology into my practices as an educator, and what tips should I know? Generally speaking, context is the first thing you want to consider. So what is the technology being used for? You don't want to adopt technologies just for the sake of doing so, and there's this famous debate between two scholars, Clark and Kozma, where they try to isolate what is actually the thing that causes student learning to change when you introduce technology. Is it the technology, or is it the practices surrounding that technology? We often compare this to like an ice cream truck, where the debate centers on whether the ice cream truck itself, the vehicle, is the thing that makes the ice cream taste good, or if it's the quality of the creation of that ice cream and its delivery, irrespective of the truck itself. The answer is that as long as you have a functional vehicle to get that ice cream from point A to point B, you're ultimately going to have a satisfied customer. That's more important than the quality of that ice cream truck, whether or not it's high-tech, fancy, etc. You can have an older ice cream truck that's maybe rusted out, and it will still do the job just as well because you're really not interested in the technology piece so much as how that technology is being applied. With respect to special education in particular, you also want to consider low versus mid versus high-tech resources because highly resource-intensive, expensive, high-tech materials are not necessarily going to do the thing you want them to do just because they're expensive. You have to be thinking about whether they fit the need that you're trying to adapt for. So if the goal is for a student to write more legibly, you don't necessarily need to buy them a $1,000 computer or iPad. You could instead give them a pencil grip, or you could find some other kind of writing implement that would do the job just as well. That means you don't need to focus so much on cost as much as you do application. It's also worth stopping and asking yourself, what do you mean by technology, quote unquote? Because the wheel or fire or a pen and paper, those are all technologies. They're just of varying levels of complexity. So you want to think about what is the tool that's necessary to solve the given problem, and understand that technologies can take the form of many different kinds of tools depending on the context you're operating in. Our second question asks, how do teachers develop pedagogical knowledge as described in the TPACK model? I don't know how much time has been spent describing what pedagogy actually means, but if you're unfamiliar with the term, it's a fancy word for teaching methods or how a teacher teaches. It's also worth considering the fact that knowledge is situated in the activity of the moment, so pedagogical knowledge comes from doing things in a classroom or other learning environment. This is why it's taught in every teaching methods course and as part of lesson planning. So in short, I would say that pedagogical knowledge comes from a combination of reading and studying pedagogies like jigsaw or small group discussion or hands-on construction, and it also comes as a function of getting experience in classrooms with either a mentor or on your own doing trial and error. Keep in mind that your experience as a student can also make a difference in understanding how and why different kinds of approaches to teaching work or don't work for different audiences. You've probably experienced in your own lifetime some opportunity in a science class that wouldn't have made as much sense in an English class and vice versa. So you want to think really carefully about who is your audience and how are you developing or tailoring the specific approaches you're using to that audience. And as you noticed with the TPACK model itself, pedagogical knowledge is just one of 3 kinds of knowledge that you're seeking to integrate when you work on a lesson plan or start thinking about how you want to adapt your classroom for your specific audience. Getting to the center of those 3 Venn diagram bubbles is essentially how you develop mastery as an educator and become more effective at doing the job that you're looking to do. Question number 3 gets at something really important, and I'm really grateful that somebody chose to ask this. Specifically, how will this class help us educate our students about internet safety? How we engage in civil discussion is probably one of the biggest challenges we face in the current moment, and schools are how we quote-unquote fix problems like this across society, so it matters that teachers consider how students can be led to think and argue without jumping to name-calling or harassment. That is, I think that safety in this case is actually a broader conversation than just how do I avoid the wrong kind of people in an online environment. A significant goal for teachers should be to model digital citizenship, and we should all be thinking about what we do in online environments and social networks as part of that process. This course is actually organized to help you do the job of being safe, so you can be a thoughtful member of digital communities and emphasize different ways that students can behave as digital citizens themselves, including using social media platforms, knowing about plagiarism and intellectual property rights, knowing how to communicate effectively in online environments, locating reliable and trustworthy information, avoiding harassment or cyberbullying, and more. If you're looking for a specific resource to dig into this idea, Google's Be Internet Awesome is very helpful for K-12 educators and students to learn about safe participation in online environments, and the ethics module that we'll be completing in the near future will actually dive into some of these topics in greater detail. Our fourth question centers on universal design, and specifically, how can universal design, or UDL, be implemented in a classroom setting? As noted in this module's reading and resources, you probably noticed that UDL is oriented toward creating maximally inclusive teaching and learning environments. Importantly, very little in teaching seems to go as planned, so you're better off if you've planned for flexibility so that you can adapt as needed in the moment. UDL is a framework that allows students to propose new ways of communicating with you as the instructor beyond whatever you initially envisioned. So, if teaching unfolds in real time as an act of creating on-the-fly instructional improvisation, UDL is the mechanism for that instructional improvisation. When somebody says, "I don't understand this," you're able to pivot to a different approach without losing the target goals or objectives. Another way to think about this might be that planning is essential, but plans themselves tend to fall apart very quickly. Therefore, educators need to think about possible dynamic solutions to potential problems, which UDL affords you the opportunity to do. There is no one correct way to utilize UDL, it's just a principle for creating lesson plans or activities that are universally inclusive and accessible. It saves you the trouble and headache of having to retrofit an already created idea for a student that wasn't able to access it as originally designed. Question number 5 is actually related to the previous question: is assistive technology always universally designed? I think I'd begin answering this question by bringing up some of the readings and resources that note that assistive technology, in quotes as a term, assumes a biomedical model of disability versus the social model of disability. So assistive technology assumes a deficit that needs to be overcome, while UDL, or Universal Design for Learning, assumes an environment itself is disabling for different kinds of people and should be better designed to avoid that disabling process. Putting that another way, assistive technology is defined as solving one specific problem for one specific person or kind of person, whereas universal design is a holistic framework that ensures everyone can benefit from the design of an object or an activity. We don't assist people who don't need assistance, so something like a curb cut is useful for many different kinds of people for different purposes because of its universality, whether you're somebody who's in a wheelchair or riding on a skateboard or pushing a baby carriage. That's the reason why we tend to, in educational technology, avoid the term assistive technology. It's just much more limiting than approaching the environment as the thing that disables or enables different kinds of people. Question number 6 gets at something we'll talk more about in one of our future modules. How close are schools to deploying virtual reality or VR technologies in classrooms, and is VR universally designed? I work on a couple of different projects that incorporate virtual reality, and one of the nice things about it is that it can teach all kinds of knowledge and skills. It has a sense of space and place and scale that is not attainable with a two-dimensional screen, and that can't be achieved without the aid of advanced digital computational technology. It can also be adapted so that somebody who's a wheelchair-bound learner might be able to learn how to saute food by using the trigger on a controller rather than having to stand over a stove and actually manually flip something in a pan. One of the biggest challenges with this, as you may have assumed, is coming up with the resources to afford the high-tech equipment necessary to run a classroom full of VR devices, especially when those things aren't available at home. Most well-run districts should be able to get VR equipment on a grant from state or federal level governments if the teacher makes a persuasive case that they're not just buying this to have stuff, but rather have an idea for purposely and wisely integrating that stuff into a class. This is especially important in the wake of COVID, where administrators, parents, community members, and others want to know that the technology you're purchasing for your classroom can solve a real problem, whether that's teaching history or making up for learning loss or some other thing that they want to fixate their attention and initiatives on. Keep in mind that VR itself is not inherently universally designed, though. As currently constructed, there are issues with eyesight requirements, mobility limitations, software exclusivity, and other issues that prevent VR from being usable by all possible audiences, and this is a hardware challenge that has to be solved with more flexibility. However, the virtual reality metaverse, as you may have heard it called, is universally designable, which means that it has the potential to be universally designed. There are historical precedents like the VersaBraille system, which is a computer keyboard that pops up Braille using photoelectric sensors in the keyboard that could present information on a screen if somebody had eyesight deficits that made it impossible for them to be able to use a typical computer. Which is to say, software can be created to allow for multiple kinds of interaction and interpretation. We just have to make sure that those software are developed that way from the beginning with a universal design framework. Finally, question 7 gets at something that's really important for all of you as you continue your education. How can educators stay up to date on new technologies as they progress their careers and are no longer hip with the times? I'll just make an editorial note here that I am not the one who used the word hip with the times. That's actually embedded in the question I received. So that's not on me, that's on the initial questioner. One of the things that my research is interested in is the notion of braided communities of practice, which means overlapping spheres of influence or control or participation depending on what communities you're a part of. As educators, we belong to multiple communities of practice at the same time, whether that's working with peers and colleagues, or administrators, or members of the community like parents, students, and others. We can remain connected to those people either through social media or finding people within our network who have educational technology experience to be able to find possibilities for new technologies to solve new problems that emerge throughout our careers. In-service PD seminars are not going to solve these problems because they just can't. Technology is everywhere in our personal and professional lives, so we need to be thinking about where we're open to using tech in informal ways to adapt to solve problems in a formal classroom setting, even if that's not where we're using or thinking about the technology initially. That is, technology use in your personal life can be a precursor or a touch point to being able to successfully implement it in a classroom. One thing that can make a significant difference is setting personal goals for yourself. Playing a video game for entertainment purposes can inform the way you think about presenting your content matter, whether that's history, language, math, science, or any other subject. Students can be a great resource given their sociocultural connections to emerging technologies, like using TikTok to communicate information to a broader audience, or using Twitter to be able to connect with a network of other professionals or experts or people who are interested in a specific subject. For specific ideas about technologies you could be incorporating into your classroom instruction, usually schools have a list of approved technologies that are functional and available to teachers in the district, but failing that, ISTE releases a list of trending tools that contain resources you may not have heard about or explored in the past. And that wraps up our initial module Q&A, so please continue to submit your questions through your initial and final thoughts discussion posts, and I'll do my best to keep answering them so that you feel like you're deconstructing the module content in a way that best fits your classroom. If you have questions that were not addressed in this particular Q&A, I will be revisiting earlier modules to make sure that I catch as many as I can. Thanks for engaging with this module's readings, resources, and activities, and I look forward to your next round of questions.